Hi, my name is Gabby Olsen, and I'm going to talk to you today about the central nervous system and motor performance. So let's start off with the brain first. To complete a task or movement, the brain coordinates areas of the central nervous system. These include the primary motor cortex, the premotor area, the supplementary motor area, cerebellum, the basal ganglia, and the brainstem. The roles of each of these structures of the central nervous system is crucial in performance. So let's first get an understanding about the functions of each. So the primary motor cortex can also be referred to as the M1. This can be seen as one of the main areas associated in completing a movement task. The M1 is located in the frontal lobe. This is called the precentral gyrus. It is here that the M1 sends neural impulses across the body's hemispheres. This is required in order to control the execution of movement. For example, so we've got the left hemisphere, it can control the right side of the body and vice versa. Other regions of the motor cortex involve the premotor area and the supplementary motor area. Now the premotor area, PMA, is located laterally to the M1. PMA is responsible in the guidance of bodily movements. This is achieved through the integration of sensory information and thus controls the proximal muscles and the trunk. The supplementary motor area, on the other hand, is located immediately to the PMA and is in front of the M1. The main role of the SMA is to coordinate and plan complex movements. Thus, the information that is stored here is sent to the M1 as well as the brainstem. So the basal ganglia is located near the cerebrum. It has several structures such as the caudate nucleus, the putamen, globus pallidus, and the subthalamic nucleus. All these structures are grouped here. The motor areas of the cortex, such as the frontal, parietal, and prefrontal areas, receive all information that passes through the basal ganglia. This information is then returned via the thalamus to the SMA. The information retained here is used to modify parameters associated with movement. The cerebellum can also be referred to as the small brain. It is located behind the cerebrum. The cerebellum has significant connections with the spinal system, cerebral cortex, and other brain structures. As a result, the cerebellum's primary function is the storing of skilled movement patterns, as it is involved in the modification and coordination of movements. This is also known as the error detection and correction. Now let's talk about the development and execution of a plan of action. In order for the central nervous system to execute an action, the limbic system has to make a decision to act. This involves the thalamus to relay information such as arousal from the hypothalamus, arousal and its selective attention from the reticular formation, and the storage of memory and emotion from the amygdala. The next phase involves the associative cortex. Here, the development of a plan occurs, which can also be referred to as conceptualization. This involves the coordination of the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. For example, the prefrontal cortex determines the selection of movement, whilst the frontal region develops appropriate strategies. This occurs through the integration of sensory information, and thus the appropriate response is then selected. The projection system, on the other hand, incorporates the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and the motor cortex to redefine and add specific details to movement. This is achieved through the development of strategic planning and activation. Lastly, the spinal system integrates all of the processes involved in the execution of movement. For instance, all systems work within one another to develop a plan, fine-tune specific details, and modify plans in order to execute a particular movement. As a class, our very first practical aimed to examine the performance changes associated with learning. We were to discuss how these changes were facilitated through changes in the integration of specific neural locations. To do this, the method involved completing a maze puzzle blindfolded across 15 trials. The task consisted of 2 people, a pencil maze, paper, pencil, and a blindfold. The procedure of the task in a pair was that one was to be the experimenter whilst the other was to be the subject. For instance, the role of the experimenter was to make sure that the lab protocols were adhered to, whilst also recording the participant's score across each trial. It is important to note that the participant was not allowed to view the maze puzzle at any stage during the task. The experimenter was only allowed to assist the subject in placing their pencil at the start of the maze. The experimenter then had to record the time it took to complete the maze across each trial, as well as writing down the number of errors or blind arrows that entered across each one. Once the first 15 trials were completed, the pair were then to switch roles. If you just have a look at the diagram in front of you, the results started significantly high. This signifies that a lot of errors were made during the first few trials. In order to perform the task, the premotor cortex was responsible for the guiding of the hand throughout the maze. This was achieved through the integration of sensory information. In contrast, as more trials were completed, there seemed to be a fluctuating decrease in errors made. This can be the result of the somatosensory motor area working towards the learning and determination of movement. For example, the SMA was mostly triggered in the initial trials, when it was essential to re-evaluate performance at each dead end. It is here that the SMA grasps an idea of what is happening. The consistency and improvement in motor performance across the trials may be due to the role of the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. For instance, information received from the motor areas of the cortex passed through the basal ganglia. This information is then used to modify movement patterns, as in this case, which way to go, forward or backwards. The modification of this information is then returned to the SMA. Likewise, the cerebellum influences the execution of the movement through intention and cues. For example, the cerebellum is responsible for the storing of patterns of movement. So when there is a detection of error, it is here that the cerebellum works with the basal ganglia in correcting the movement through fine-tuning. Overall, the interconnection within the central nervous system allows the participants to gain an idea about the motor characteristics involved in the task. This then can allow a greater understanding of movement patterns through the use of memory. For example, the results indicate this, as the end results convey less errors were made at quicker times. However, a limitation to this practical may be that the first experimenter had a greater idea of the task at hand compared to the subject, as they had viewed the maze puzzle before attempting the task themselves. Subsequently, the brain is a complex structure that has the ability to change, remodel, and reorganise to adapt to new situations or tasks. This is referred to as neuroplasticity. If there were to be any implications towards neuroplasticity, it could be the result of a brain injury, such as stroke. For example, if damage has occurred to the central nervous system, specifically to the neural networks, this will impair sensations, movement, and cognition. Furthermore, brain damage can cause neuronal death, which can lead to diseases such as Parkinson's disease. Thus, in relation to our practical, people with Parkinson's disease or who have incurred a stroke or brain damage will have lots of trouble connecting between tasks and error. So in other words, results will convey a lot more errors as they will struggle to integrate sensory information within the brain structures to be able to relate to which way to go, forward or backward.